This video is a continuation. If you have not yet listened to the previous story on this channel, this reflection may feel incomplete. The story showed what happened, how events unfolded, and how history moved forward. This video exists in the quiet space after that story, where explanation replaces narration and patterns begin to surface. What follows is not a new story, and it is not an academic analysis. It is a reflection on what was already told, an exploration of the human forces beneath the events you witnessed. The mechanisms that carried the story forward were not unique to one time or one place. They are deeply human, familiar, and still present. This video is meant to be listened to slowly, as a companion to the story before it. Not to judge, not to accuse, but to understand how ordinary people adapt to extraordinary systems, and why those adaptations can feel natural while they are happening. If you are ready, we will begin where the story ended. After the story ended, after the rise and the collapse had passed through the mind like a long shadow, a quieter question remained. Not a historical question and not a political one, but something far more human. As the events unfolded, as people aligned, adapted, and continued, it became clear that what carried history forward was not only the will of one individual, but the silent participation of many others who adjusted themselves to what felt stable at the time. Human beings are not born craving power. They are born craving stability. From the earliest moments of life, the nervous system searches for rhythm, for predictable sounds, repeated patterns, and familiar presence. Long before the mind is convinced, the body responds to order. Chaos is frightening, not because it is violent, but because it is uncertain. Uncertainty demands constant attention, constant evaluation, and endless decision-making. It exhausts the mind and unsettles the body. Order offers relief. When the world feels structured, the mind can finally rest. When rules are clear, choices feel lighter. When expectations are defined, life becomes manageable. This is not weakness, and it is not moral failure. It is biological. Stability allows human beings to function without being overwhelmed by possibility. In the story you listened to before, moments of instability appeared again and again. Economic uncertainty, social fragmentation, and a loss of direction created an atmosphere in which people were no longer searching for truth, but for something that would hold. In such moments, the first question is rarely, what is right? It is, what will keep things from falling apart? Order promises to hold things together. At first it appears quietly, through routines, schedules, procedures, and hierarchies. None of these feel dangerous. They feel adult, responsible, and reassuring. Order creates the sense that someone is paying attention so that you do not have to. Responsibility feels distributed, and the burden of constant judgment begins to fade. Someone decides, someone organizes, someone ensures continuity, and life becomes predictable again. This predictability is deeply comforting. When behavior is standardized, mistakes feel less personal. If something goes wrong, it belongs to the system rather than the individual. This distance reduces anxiety. It allows people to continue without constantly questioning themselves. Order also provides meaning, not the kind that requires deep reflection, but the kind that answers simple questions. Where you belong, what is expected of you, and what role you play. Roles reduce uncertainty. When your place is defined, you do not have to invent yourself each day. In the story, many people did not feel powerful, but they did feel placed. Placed within a structure that promised coherence during instability. This is how order begins to feel necessary, not because it is perfect, but because it feels safer than disorder. At this early stage, order does not feel restrictive. It feels supportive. Rules appear protective, hierarchy appears clarifying, and authority appears stabilizing. Only later does order begin to ask more. But by then, the memory of chaos has already settled into the body, and the mind prefers not to return there. The relief has become a habit. This is the first layer beneath the story. Not ideology, not manipulation, but a deeply human preference for calm over chaos, for structure over uncertainty, and for order over exhaustion. There is nothing immoral about this preference, but it is exploitable, and once exploited, it can carry people much farther than they ever intended to go. The story showed the destination. This chapter explains why the path felt so easy to enter, and why, once inside, so few felt the urge to turn back. If order explains why people seek stability, obedience explains how they learn to stay within it. Obedience is often mistaken for a personality trait, as if some people are simply born more compliant than others. But obedience is not innate. It is learned slowly, patiently, and almost invisibly, long before history ever asks anything dramatic of anyone. In early life, obedience begins as a practical lesson. Children are not naturally compliant. They are curious, impulsive, and testing by nature. What they learn very early on is not submission, but cause and effect. Certain behaviors reduce conflict, others increase it. Compliance brings approval, safety, and predictability, while resistance brings friction, correction, or isolation. Over time, the lesson becomes internalized. Belonging follows cooperation. This learning is not cruel, it is functional. Families need order to survive, and children adapt because adaptation works. What matters is not the intention behind this learning, but its cumulative effect. Gradually, approval becomes conditional, and rules begin to feel like the natural framework of relationships. Obedience is no longer experienced as something imposed from outside, but as something that maintains harmony. As life expands beyond the family, this pattern becomes formalized. Schools transform obedience into routine. Schedules replace spontaneity. Evaluation replaces exploration, and success becomes something measured externally. Instructions are followed, expectations are met, and rewards are distributed accordingly. Most people do not experience this as oppression. They experience it as preparation. Adaptation feels intelligent inside structured environments because it allows people to function without constant conflict. By adulthood, obedience no longer feels like obedience. It feels normal. It is embedded in habits, language, and professional roles. Workplaces reinforce the pattern quietly. Hierarchies define authority. Job descriptions define responsibility. And tasks are divided so efficiently that very few people ever see the whole picture. Responsibility moves upward, while execution moves downward, and this separation creates psychological distance. This distance is crucial. When individuals are asked to perform tasks rather than make decisions, moral evaluation becomes secondary to procedural accuracy. People begin to measure themselves not by the consequences of their actions, but by how well they followed instructions. Did I do my job? Replaces, should this be done? This shift does not feel dangerous. It feels professional. In the story you heard before, many people did not wake up one day prepared to participate in something harmful. They woke up prepared to function. They had learned over years that functioning meant following established procedures, respecting authority, and avoiding disruption. Obedience had become associated with competence, reliability, and maturity. Resistance, by contrast, felt inefficient and risky. What makes this learning so powerful is that it reduces moral strain. Constant ethical evaluation is exhausting. Obedience offers relief by transferring responsibility elsewhere. Decisions belong to leaders, systems, or institutions. Individuals focus on their part. This fragmentation allows people to act without feeling like agents of consequence. Harm, when it occurs, feels distant, abstract, and diluted across many hands. Importantly, most people are not lying when they say they felt powerless. Within the structures they inhabited, their agency was genuinely limited. But limitation does not erase participation. It simply makes participation easier to accept. Obedience works not because people stop caring, but because caring is gradually redirected away from outcomes and toward roles. This is the second layer beneath the story. Obedience is not sudden, and it is not extreme. It is the product of long conditioning that teaches people to function smoothly inside systems they did not design. By the time obedience is required in morally complex situations, it already feels familiar, reasonable, and expected. The story showed people moving in alignment. This chapter explains how alignment becomes a skill, practiced quietly over a lifetime, until following feels safer than questioning, and compliance feels like competence rather than choice. If obedience explains how people learn to stay within systems, fear explains how those systems begin to reshape judgment itself. Fear does not erase morality. People do not suddenly forget what they believe is right or wrong. What fear changes is not conscience, but calculation. Under fear, the way decisions are weighed becomes narrower, faster, and more urgent. In stable conditions, moral thinking is expansive. People consider consequences, fairness, and long-term impact. They ask who might be harmed, who might benefit, and whether alternatives exist. Fear compresses this process. It pulls attention toward immediacy. Tomorrow fades. Context shrinks. What matters most is reducing danger in the present moment. This shift is subtle. Fear does not arrive as panic in most cases. Panic disrupts systems. What systems require is a quieter form of fear, one that settles into daily life like background noise. A persistent sense that something could go wrong, that stability is fragile, and that mistakes carry consequences. Under these conditions, people do not abandon their values, but they begin to prioritize safety over complexity. In the story you listened to earlier, fear did not always appear as terror. Often, it appeared as uncertainty. Economic insecurity, social instability, and the feeling that familiar structures were dissolving created an environment in which moral questions felt heavy and exhausting. Fear made people tired. Tired people look for shortcuts. They look for decisions that feel protective rather than reflective. Fear rewards justification. When actions are framed as necessary responses to danger, people are more willing to accept compromises. They tell themselves that certain measures are temporary, that certain costs are unfortunate but unavoidable, and that questioning too much might make things worse. These rationalizations are not lies. They are psychological strategies for maintaining coherence under pressure. As fear persists, it reshapes social perception. Ambiguity becomes uncomfortable. Complexity feels unsafe. The mind begins to prefer clear categories, simple explanations, and decisive authority. This preference is not ideological. It is neurological. Under threat, the brain prioritizes speed and certainty over nuance and deliberation. Slow moral reflection feels like a liability. This is why fear changes social norms. Behaviors that once felt questionable begin to feel responsible. Compliance becomes associated with care, while hesitation begins to look reckless. Those who question appear naive, detached from reality, or unwilling to accept risk. Fear quietly reframes dissent as danger, not because dissent is wrong, but because it slows response. Another effect of fear is the diffusion of responsibility. When everyone feels threatened, individual decisions feel less significant. People look around and see others behaving similarly, which reinforces the sense that actions are necessary rather than chosen. Collective movement reduces personal doubt. If everyone is doing this, it must be justified. This shared behavior offers emotional shelter. Over time, fear does not need to be emphasized. It becomes assumed. People adapt to it. Adaptation feels like maturity. It feels realistic. Those who refuse to adapt appear idealistic or irresponsible. Fear does not silence conscience completely. It overwhelms it. It crowds out space for questioning by filling the mind with urgency. This is the third layer beneath the story. Harmful outcomes do not require people to stop caring. They require people to feel that caring must be postponed. Fear convinces them that there will be time later to reflect, to correct, and to restore what was compromised. Later rarely arrives, but the belief that it will makes the present easier to endure. The story showed moments where choices narrowed and consequences escalated. This chapter explains why those moments did not feel like moral crossroads at the time. Fear reshaped judgment so quietly that many people did not experience their decisions as ethical failures, but as reasonable responses to an unstable world. As fear reshapes judgment, another mechanism quietly takes hold, one that allows people to continue acting without feeling that they are the authors of what follows. This mechanism is delegated responsibility. It is not loud, and it is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as surrender. It presents itself as structure. Human beings carry moral weight more easily when they believe they are choosing. When choice is removed, or appears to be removed, that weight becomes lighter. Delegated responsibility works by separating decision from action. Someone else decides. Someone else defines the rules. Someone else carries the authority. The individual carries out a task, often a small one, clearly defined, limited in scope, and framed as necessary. This separation feels relieving. Decisions are heavy. They require judgment, foresight, and the willingness to live with consequences. Tasks feel simpler. They have instructions, timelines, and measurable outcomes. When people are asked to perform tasks rather than make decisions, they experience themselves as instruments rather than agents. Instruments do not feel morally burdened. They feel functional. In the story you listened to before, many actions did not feel personal to the people carrying them out. They felt procedural. Paperwork was completed. Orders were transmitted. Routines were followed. Each step, taken alone, appeared neutral, necessary, even boring. No single step felt like a turning point. And because no single step felt decisive, responsibility dissolved into motion. This is how large systems protect the conscience of those inside them. They fragment action so thoroughly that no individual sees the whole. One person prepares information, another reviews it, another authorizes it, another implements it. Each person can say, truthfully, that they did not control the outcome. Each person feels replaceable. Replaceability reduces guilt. If someone else would have done the same thing, the action feels less personal. Delegated responsibility also hides behind professionalism. Professional language is calm, precise, and emotionally restrained. It values efficiency, consistency, and adherence to procedure. Within this frame, moral questioning can feel inappropriate, even unprofessional. Personal doubts are reframed as emotional interference. Objectivity becomes a virtue, and distance becomes a sign of competence. Over time, people learn to evaluate themselves not by the effects of their actions, but by how well they performed their role. Did they follow the rules? Did they meet expectations? Did they avoid mistakes? These questions replace deeper ones. Moral evaluation does not disappear. It is simply redirected. Integrity becomes synonymous with reliability. Responsibility becomes synonymous with obedience. This redirection is subtle but powerful. When responsibility is delegated upward, individuals begin to feel both powerless and protected. Powerless because they cannot change the system, protected because they are not expected to. This combination is psychologically stable. It allows people to continue without confronting the full meaning of what they are contributing to. Importantly, most people do not experience this as self-deception. They are not pretending. Within the boundaries of their role, their perception is accurate. Their influence is limited. Their options are constrained. What is missing is not honesty, but scope. They see their part clearly, but not the whole. And without the whole, judgment feels abstract and distant. Delegated responsibility also spreads moral cost across many individuals. When harm occurs, it does not point back to one face or one decision. It disperses. Each person carries a fraction so small that it feels bearable. Shared burden becomes diluted burden. Diluted burden rarely triggers resistance. This is why systems that rely on delegated responsibility can function smoothly even as consequences escalate. They do not require cruelty. They require organization. They do not demand belief. They demand compliance with role expectations. People continue not because they agree, but because the structure makes stopping feel both ineffective and unnecessary. This is the fourth layer beneath the story. What appears, from the outside, as collective action driven by ideology often feels, from the inside, like routine execution. People do not feel like authors of history. They feel like participants in a process that is already moving. The story showed outcomes that now feel overwhelming in hindsight. This chapter explains why, at the time, so few individuals experienced themselves as standing at a moral crossroads. Responsibility had been divided, professionalized, and placed just far enough away to feel out of reach. Responsibility becomes fragmented, and fear reshapes judgment. A question begins to surface quietly in the minds of some people. It is not a loud question, and it is rarely spoken aloud. It is simply this: should I resist? The answer, in most cases, is not determined by morality alone. It is determined by risk. Resistance is often imagined as a heroic act, clear and decisive, fueled by certainty and courage. But in reality, resistance rarely feels heroic from the inside. It feels isolating, uncertain, and expensive. It does not announce itself as a moral victory. It announces itself as a disruption of everything that still feels stable. Human beings are deeply sensitive to social cost. Belonging regulates emotion, reduces anxiety, and creates a sense of safety. To resist a system is not only to oppose rules, but to step outside the language, expectations, and protection that the system provides. This step feels dangerous long before any punishment appears. In the story you listened to earlier, resistance did not fail because people lacked awareness. It failed because awareness alone does not eliminate fear. Those who noticed that something was wrong still had to calculate what resistance would mean for their lives. Would it change anything? Would anyone listen? Would it cost their job, their safety, their family's stability, their place in the community? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are assessments. Most people calculate risk conservatively, especially when uncertainty is already high. Resistance rarely comes with guarantees. Silence, by contrast, offers continuity. It allows life to proceed without immediate rupture. Systems understand this intuitively. They do not need to punish everyone who resists. They only need to make examples rare and ambiguous. Often, the cost of resistance is not formal punishment, but subtle exclusion. Opportunities disappear, trust erodes, access narrows. None of this feels dramatic enough to justify confrontation, but all of it feels uncomfortable enough to discourage imitation. Resistance also threatens identity. People define themselves through roles: professional, parent, citizen, colleague. These roles come with expectations, and resisting may place them at risk. To resist is not only to challenge authority, but to question who you are within the structure that gives your life coherence. This is psychologically destabilizing. Another factor quietly at work is isolation. Resistance often feels lonely because doubt is rarely visible. When most people remain silent, each individual believes they are alone in their concern. This illusion of isolation reinforces inaction. Silence confirms silence. The absence of visible resistance is interpreted as consent, even when it is not. Over time, resistance begins to feel not only risky, but inappropriate. Those who question are framed as disruptive, unrealistic, or irresponsible. They are accused of destabilizing order at a time when stability feels essential. Concern is weaponized against them. Now is not the time, they are told. You are making things worse. These accusations are effective because they appeal to the same fear that keeps others compliant. Eventually, silence becomes habitual. It no longer feels like a choice. It feels like adaptation. People tell themselves that they are being pragmatic, mature, realistic. They are not giving up values, they believe. They are postponing action until conditions improve. But postponement has a way of extending itself indefinitely. This is the fifth layer beneath the story. Resistance is rare not because people do not care, but because caring has been made costly. The system does not need to eliminate opposition. It only needs to make opposition feel lonely, uncertain, and unlikely to succeed. The story showed long periods where little seemed to interrupt the flow of events. This chapter explains why those interruptions were so rare. Resistance did not disappear. It was simply outpaced by fear, routine, and the quiet calculation that silence was safer than standing alone. Up to this point, fear has appeared as a pressure, something external that weighs on judgment and narrows choice. But there comes a moment when fear no longer feels like a reaction. It settles. It stabilizes. And when it does, it begins to transform into something else entirely. Fear becomes order. This transformation does not happen during moments of chaos. It happens after chaos has exhausted people. When uncertainty has lingered long enough, when instability has drained attention and energy, fear no longer needs to announce itself. It no longer needs to shock. It becomes a constant background presence, quiet but persistent, shaping expectations rather than emotions. In this phase, people are no longer asking how to escape fear. They are asking how to live with it. And living with fear requires structure. Structure promises predictability. Predictability promises rest. Order becomes the answer, not as an ideology, but as a psychological necessity. In the story you listened to before, there was a point at which disorder no longer felt tolerable. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was endless. When instability stretches on, people begin to accept restrictions not as losses, but as relief. Rules feel grounding. Boundaries feel clarifying. Authority feels reassuring, not because it is benevolent, but because it appears decisive. This is where fear changes its function. It no longer drives panic. It drives compliance through normalization. People stop noticing fear as an emotion because it has been translated into routine. Schedules, regulations, procedures, and expectations quietly absorb it. Fear becomes organized. Order born from fear does not present itself as control. It presents itself as management, risk management, crisis management, stability management. The language is calm, technical, and reassuring. It does not demand obedience. It explains necessity, and necessity is difficult to argue with. As order solidifies, security becomes a moral frame. Actions are no longer evaluated primarily by their fairness, but by their ability to prevent harm. Safety rises above other values. Privacy, autonomy, and complexity are reframed as secondary concerns, luxuries to be revisited once stability is secured. People accept this postponement because they believe it is temporary. Temporary measures, however, have a tendency to settle. Fear does not need to be constantly renewed for them to remain in place. Once order has reduced uncertainty, people grow attached to it. The calm it produces feels earned. Letting go of it feels risky. Even those who once questioned restrictions begin to defend them, not because they believe deeply in them, but because they fear returning to instability. At this stage, control becomes subtle. It no longer relies on enforcement alone. People begin to regulate themselves. They anticipate expectations. They adjust behavior before correction is needed. They internalize boundaries and call it responsibility. Self-control replaces external pressure, and this makes the system efficient and resilient. This internalization changes how freedom is experienced. Freedom no longer feels like an open space. It feels conditional. People begin to ask not what they want to do, but what is allowed, appropriate, or advisable. Permission becomes a quiet framework for decision-making. Life narrows, not through force, but through caution. In the story, this narrowing did not feel like loss at first. It felt like maturity. People told themselves they were being realistic, careful, and considerate. They were not abandoning values. They were adapting them to circumstances. Fear made adaptation feel wise. Order rewarded it. Over time, order stops being questioned because it stops being visible. It becomes the background against which life unfolds. People forget what alternatives felt like. Memory adjusts. The past is reinterpreted as chaotic, irresponsible, or naive. The present feels stable by comparison, even if it is restrictive. This is the sixth layer beneath the story. Fear does not simply coerce people into obedience. It trains them to desire order. Once that desire takes root, the system no longer needs to push. It is pulled forward by people who want stability more than they want freedom, predictability more than complexity, and relief more than reflection. The story showed how events moved forward with remarkable efficiency once this stage was reached. This chapter explains why that movement felt natural to so many. Fear had done its work. It had reorganized life into something manageable. And once fear becomes order, resistance no longer feels urgent. It feels unnecessary. Once fear has been translated into order, something even more powerful begins to happen. The extraordinary becomes familiar. What was once tolerated becomes expected. What was once questioned becomes routine. This is the process of normalization, and it is one of the quietest transformations in human behavior. Normalization does not feel like surrender. It feels like adjustment. People pride themselves on adapting well. Adaptation feels intelligent, mature, and realistic. When new conditions persist long enough, the mind stops registering them as changes and begins to treat them as the environment itself. What repeats without interruption becomes normal. In the story you listened to before, there were moments that would have felt unthinkable in earlier times. Yet, as they repeated, they began to lose their sharpness. The first time something restrictive appeared, it felt noticeable. The second time, it felt familiar. By the third time, it felt expected. Each repetition softened the emotional response until concern faded into routine. Human attention is limited. It cannot remain in a state of constant alarm. When conditions do not improve, people adapt not because they agree, but because they must continue living. Daily life requires energy, and normalization conserves it. By accepting new boundaries as normal, people reduce internal conflict and regain a sense of psychological balance. This adaptation reshapes memory. The past is reinterpreted through the lens of the present. What once felt free begins to feel chaotic in retrospect. What once felt restrictive begins to feel responsible. Memory adjusts to support continuity because continuity feels safer than disruption. Over time, people forget not only how things were, but that they were ever different at all. Normalization also spreads socially. People observe one another constantly. When everyone around you behaves as if something is normal, it becomes difficult to maintain a sense that it is not. Social cues replace internal judgment. If no one reacts, reaction feels unnecessary. Silence becomes confirmation. Familiarity becomes legitimacy. At this stage, systems no longer need to justify themselves. Justification implies doubt. Normality does not explain, it simply exists. People stop asking why certain rules are in place and begin asking how best to live within them. Life reorganizes itself around the new boundaries. Careers, relationships, and expectations adjust quietly, without announcement. Children born into normalized conditions experience them as reality, not as change. Absence becomes invisible when it has always been present. Limits feel natural when they are not contrasted with alternatives. This is how normalization extends beyond one generation. It does not need to be taught explicitly. It is absorbed. What makes normalization so effective is that it does not feel oppressive. It feels ordinary. Ordinary things do not demand attention. They do not provoke outrage. They are managed, navigated, and accepted. Over time, even those who once questioned the system begin to defend it, not out of conviction, but out of habit. In the story, this stage was marked by calm, not peace, but stability. Conflict appeared minimal. Life appeared orderly. From the inside, the system felt functional. From the outside, the consequences were becoming increasingly clear. Normalization created a gap between experience and outcome, between what people felt and what was happening. This is the seventh layer beneath the story. Harmful conditions do not persist because people constantly endorse them. They persist because they fade into the background of everyday life. Once normalized, they are no longer experienced as choices. They are experienced as facts. And facts, when left unexamined, rarely inspire resistance. As normalization settles in, another transformation unfolds quietly alongside it. The system does not only define what is normal, it also defines who is included within that normality. Exclusion rarely begins with hostility. It begins with distance. And distance, once normalized, becomes easy to overlook. At first, difference is simply noted. People are described as having different roles, habits, or circumstances. This feels neutral. Categorization helps the mind organize complexity. But when categorization hardens, difference begins to imply incompatibility. Incompatibility sounds practical, not cruel. It suggests management rather than rejection. In the story you listened to earlier, exclusion did not arrive with declarations or dramatic breaks. It arrived through small adjustments, different expectations, different access, different assumptions. None of these changes felt severe on their own. Most people were unaffected, and distance protected acceptance. What does not touch daily life rarely demands attention. Language plays a quiet role here. Groups are discussed less as individuals and more as aggregates. Statistics replace stories. Trends replace faces. When people are described in abstract terms, emotional connection weakens. Detachment does not feel like harm, it feels like efficiency. Decisions framed as logistical appear responsible, even when their consequences are deeply personal. As distance grows, empathy thins. Empathy requires proximity, shared spaces, shared narratives, shared concern. Distance removes these gently. Responsibility fades not because people stop caring, but because caring feels less immediate. The excluded become peripheral to everyday thought, and peripheral things are easier to ignore. Small exceptions accelerate this process. Rules are adjusted for specific cases, framed as temporary responses to particular risks. Exceptions promise that core values remain intact. People accept them because they believe normality will return. But once an exception exists, it establishes a precedent. The system learns that values can bend without breaking. Over time, exceptions accumulate. Each one appears reasonable. Together, they reshape the rule. What was once temporary becomes routine. Routine becomes policy. Policy becomes reality. Reversal feels risky, not because it is wrong, but because it would disrupt stability. Stability, once regained, is fiercely protected. At this stage, exclusion begins to attach itself to identity. Belonging is framed positively through language of community, values, and normal life. Those who fit feel affirmed. Those who do not fit are simply absent from the narrative. Silence replaces prohibition. When a group is no longer addressed, its exclusion feels natural. Identity-based exclusion is resilient because it does not rely on punishment, it relies on attachment. People defend boundaries not because they hate those outside them, but because those boundaries give meaning to who they are inside. Questioning exclusion feels like questioning identity itself, and that feels threatening. As exclusion becomes normal, it stops being seen as an action and starts being seen as reality. People no longer ask whether it should exist. They ask how to live within it. Lives are built around existing boundaries, careers, relationships, futures. Changing the boundaries would require reimagining life itself, and that feels costly. Children grow up without noticing what is missing. Absence feels natural when it has always been there. Memory reshapes itself around the present. The system is remembered as it exists, not as it emerged. Without memory of change, change feels unnecessary. This is the eighth layer beneath the story. Exclusion persists not because it is constantly enforced, but because it becomes ordinary. Ordinary things do not provoke outrage. They are navigated, managed, and accepted. Empathy may still surface in private moments, but it rarely translates into action, because action would disturb normality. The story showed outcomes that, in hindsight, feel stark and undeniable. This chapter explains why, at the time, those outcomes were accompanied by so little visible resistance. Exclusion had been woven into daily life so gently that it no longer felt like exclusion at all. It felt like the way things were. By the time order has stabilized, fear has faded into the background, and exclusion has become ordinary. Something subtle but profound has already changed. Judgment, once exercised individually, has begun to withdraw. In its place, order takes over. Not aggressively and not all at once, but gradually as a form of relief. Judgment is demanding. It requires attention, context, and the willingness to carry responsibility. To judge is to pause, to weigh alternatives, and to accept uncertainty. Order removes this burden. It answers questions before they are asked. It defines correct behavior in advance. It reduces complexity into procedure. This reduction feels efficient. Efficiency is deeply attractive to the human mind, especially after long periods of instability. When systems run smoothly, people are spared the exhaustion of constant decision-making. Instead of asking, "What should be done?" they ask what is required. The shift feels practical, even mature. As this shift settles in, people begin to trust the system's judgment more than their own. This trust is not blind, it is learned. The system appears consistent. Predictable outcomes reinforce confidence. When following rules leads to stability, rules acquire legitimacy. Individual doubt begins to feel unnecessary, even disruptive. Language adapts to support this transition. Words like process, implementation, and outcome replace words like choice and responsibility. Harm is reframed as an unfortunate side effect of necessary operations. Necessary things are managed, not questioned. Emotional responses are seen as interference with function. Over time, people become skilled operators within the system. They know how to follow procedures precisely. They learn how to anticipate expectations and avoid friction. What they gradually lose is the habit of evaluation. Moral judgment, unused, weakens. Not because it is rejected, but because it is no longer practiced. This does not feel like loss. It feels like professionalism. Professionalism is morally reassuring. It signals competence, reliability, and self-control. Systems reward those who perform well within them. Performance becomes the primary metric, replacing integrity as the measure of success. When order replaces judgment, compliance does not feel like obedience. It feels like alignment. People do not experience themselves as choosing wrongly. They experience themselves as functioning correctly. The system no longer needs persuasion. It simply continues. At this stage, dissent feels impractical rather than immoral. Those who continue to question appear inefficient, emotional, or detached from reality. Their concerns feel abstract compared to the tangible benefits of stability. Order presents itself as neutral, while judgment appears subjective. This neutrality is deceptive. Order is never neutral. It reflects values embedded within structure. But when judgment is outsourced, those values remain unexamined. The system decides what matters, what is prioritized, and what is ignored. People maintain it not because they agree with every outcome, but because maintenance feels easier than interruption. Interruption would require effort, courage, and clarity. It would demand a return to uncertainty. After long adaptation, uncertainty feels threatening. Order has trained people to prefer continuation over reflection. This is the ninth layer beneath the story. What began as a desire for stability has become a replacement for moral agency. The system no longer asks for consent, it only requires maintenance. People provide it automatically because doing so feels normal, responsible, and safe. The story revealed how events progressed with increasing momentum. This chapter explains why that momentum encountered so little resistance. Judgment had been quietly replaced by order, and without judgment, there was nothing left to stop the system from moving forward. After the story has been told, and after its deeper mechanisms have been quietly unfolded, what remains is not a conclusion, but a state of awareness. Not an answer, and not a verdict, but a pause in which patterns become visible. Nothing described here belongs only to the past. The forces beneath the story are not relics. They are human tendencies, ordinary, familiar, and deeply understandable. The desire for order, the comfort of obedience, the narrowing effect of fear, the relief of delegated responsibility, the cost of resistance, the calm of normalization, the quiet spread of exclusion, and the gradual replacement of judgment with structure are not signs of moral failure. They are signs of adaptation. This is why these patterns are so powerful. They do not rely on hatred. They do not require cruelty. They operate through comfort, efficiency, and relief. They move forward not because people stop caring, but because caring becomes complicated, exhausting, and risky. The system does not need to convince people that it is right. It only needs to convince them that it works. Awareness begins when we notice how easily responsibility slips away, when decisions are framed as procedure, how quickly fear reframes compromise as necessity, and how naturally normality settles around boundaries that were once unthinkable. It begins when we recognize that stability, while necessary, can also anesthetize reflection if left unexamined. This reflection is not an invitation to distrust order, nor to reject structure. Order allows societies to function. Structure allows lives to continue. The danger does not lie in order itself, but in forgetting that order is a tool, not a conscience. Tools require users who remember when and why they are being used. The story showed what happened when momentum went uninterrupted. This reflection explains how interruption became difficult long before the consequences were clear. Awareness does not demand certainty. It demands attention. Attention to moments when rules feel easier than responsibility, when silence feels safer than speech, and when adaptation feels indistinguishable from agreement. No one is immune to these patterns. Not the educated, not the well-intentioned, not the cautious. The question is not whether someone would have acted differently in the past. That question flatters the present. The more honest question is whether we recognize the conditions that make acting differently feel unnecessary. History does not repeat itself because people forget facts. It repeats because patterns feel familiar. Familiarity lowers vigilance. Vigilance fades into habit, and habit, when left unexamined, carries momentum forward without asking permission. This video does not ask for outrage. It does not ask for judgment. It asks for awareness. Awareness that remains quiet, steady, and patient. The kind that notices when comfort replaces questioning, when efficiency replaces empathy, and when order begins to think in our place. The story has ended. The reflection ends here as well. What remains is not instruction, but attention, because attention is the first interruption. And interruption, however small, is the beginning of choice. As this reflection comes to a close, there is nothing left to prove and nothing left to argue. The story has already been told, and the patterns beneath it have already passed quietly through your mind. What remains now is not judgment, but awareness, the kind that settles slowly, like night after a long day. History does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers through repetition, through habits that feel ordinary, through choices that feel reasonable at the time they are made. What shapes the world most often is not cruelty, but comfort, not chaos, but the calm that comes from letting things continue without interruption. This video was never meant to accuse or instruct. It exists only as a companion to the story you have already heard, a quiet space to notice what often goes unseen while events are unfolding. The need for order, the ease of obedience, the silence of adaptation, and the way judgment slowly hands itself over to structure are not distant ideas. They are human, familiar, and close. If anything lingers after this, let it be attention. Attention to moments when comfort replaces questioning, when routine feels safer than reflection, and when silence feels easier than choice. These moments are not failures. They are invitations to pause. For now, there is nothing more to do. Let the story rest. Let the reflection fade gently, and carry only what feels useful, leaving the rest behind. Thank you for listening quietly. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is there, may the night be calm and the silence kind.